Oh, hello. This is Paola, Paola Di Maio, Ronin scholar, finally re-recording the audio for a Ronin public seminar, actually a webinar that was held in December 2021, for which there were some technical problems, audio, connectivity. So I promised I would re-record, and here I am, almost a year later. So apologies for the delay. Uh, the recording the webinar and the seminar took approximately 1 hour, so I'm going to try to stick to the 1 hour mark even for the recording, although the 1 hour is probably more relevant for the online seminar. So once the recording is listened to in the audience own time, it could take longer, but I'm not going to bore you excessively. I'm going to try to make the points that I would like to make as quickly as possible. The reason why I think there should be a record of this webinar, audible record, is because I haven't gotten around to write the paper, which is again something which I'm planning to do, but also because a lot of the points we've been discussing, uh, starting from this seminar or webinar, are actually being referenced, and they're coming up again and again. So I thought, let's make the webinar audible. One last note that I may or may not speak at the correct pace, but an excellent feature of YouTube is that you can play the recording and the video at your own speed. I always listen to YouTube videos at double the speed because it's much more time efficient for me to listen to whatever, unless sometimes I need to slow them down for whatever reason. Maybe I'm learning a language or I'm learning some coding and I need to go slower, so I slow them. So I would recommend that you listen to this video at 1.5 speed, because it's not rocket science, and occasionally I pause because I'm trying to focus on what I'm trying to say. So here we go. The seminar or the webinar has been motivated by a desire to contribute to independent scholarship discourse. In particular, there have been, I'm a member of both Ronin Institute and IGDOR, and there have been attempts to collaborate on independent scholarship, promoting independent scholarship. And for me, there are much deeper issues that have to be dealt with. They don't have to be dealt with academically, but there are foundational issues that need to be brought up. And often during these summits or unconferences, we had the most recent one in September, the way the activities are set up is like, we don't have time to go into deep analysis. So I thought I would pick out on some of the topics which are fundamental and should be on the agenda. Uh, and I would put them on a few slides. And here is my uh, webinar topic. So last year, I wrote a paper on epistemic inclusivity. There is a reference somewhere. And I wanted to connect this epistemic inclusivity notion, which I contributed in a paper on participatory conferences, to the earlier notion of epistemic anarchy, which is notably attributed to Fairbairn, but could also have other authors. And I would also like to make the case for increasing diversity of methods, and having more pluralistic views in research. And there is Ronin Institute and IGDOR are embracing this plurality of views in their ethos. And I think we should emphasize that ultimately science is also going in that direction. Um, Another aim is to create a system view of intertransdisciplinary open science and meta science. Mm, actually, I contribute a new definition for meta-science, which I would like people to either use or criticize or build on, expand, improve, so to speak. And I'm also having a go at the unenlightened scientific establishment, which is, I have no words, not enough words to comment on that, but there is nothing we can do about it other than trying to do things better. But I want to bring out a few points, pain points, so to speak. I would also like to align this aspect of science that I'm doing with enlightened practice. I don't know. I cannot remember whether what I wrote in the slides about enlightened practices. But I devote a branch of my attention, my studies to learn about enlightenment in terms of Buddhist enlightenment. Like, can people actually become enlightened? And of course, just conceiving the notion of enlightenment is very, very, takes you completely out of what is considered ordinary science. At the same time, we can use scientific method to investigate certain aspects of this enlightenment and appreciate that maybe there is something there, and that maybe there is a role for studying enlightenment with scientific method. Maybe there is a role for using enlightenment to improve scientific method more wisely, so to speak. And there is also scope for leaving the two things alone, like scientific work and enlightenment may not always belong together. But I just wanted to make a note there, and then following up on some conversations with peers that I've had throughout the years. And that's 5 minutes, isn't it? Ooh. So what a seminar is not about Fairbairn, biography, personality of bibliography. There's a lot of controversy there. I don't know enough myself. I just pick out relevant references. And it's not about philosophy or science in general. So in a paper which is referenced here, the term epistemic inclusivity came up. In fact, I contributed it. And the reason why I wanted to start the seminar talking about epistemic inclusivity is because participatory science, as often portrayed, is in fact sometimes a token thing. People say, "Oh yeah, everybody can contribute to research, da da da," but then they actually assign a role and I said, "Oh yeah, you're gonna do the literature review, aren't you? And you're gonna do this and then so someone already decides a priori what the research should do or be or conclude, what the findings are." And normally the team of scientists, however inclusive, cannot really deviate from that. It's like, you have to stick to your thing. You cannot just come up with your own idea. I have experienced that, where people said, "Oh yes, participatory science, you're very welcome to make a contribution, but you cannot make an original contribution, You just have to contribute to the literature review." And I thought that was preposterous, something which I couldn't believe I was listening to, and in a context of, high level, intelligent, so-called open science. The promoters of open science are actually quite, can be quite leveraging the term open science to define whatever they think is science anyway. So I insisted on this point and I said, okay, participatory research must be inclusive not only in terms of timetables, schedules, languages, which is all great, but it must include multiple lines of inquiry. In fact, I just noticed that I say multiple line of inquiries, but it should be multiple line of inquiry. Broad perspective, contradictory views. Sometimes, there is no consensus within, you have to explore all the possible lines of inquiry, basically. and even acknowledging or taking into account different scientific paradigms, such as a multiplicity of theories and hypotheses, can be formulated and discussed instead of only the dominant ones. But eventually, I managed to get this epistemic inclusivity included in the paper and attributed to me, although I must thank some of the colleagues who rephrased it better. They made it more elegant. But the notion of epistemic inclusivity means we need to acknowledge in research and science not only that there are different languages, timetables, ethnic backgrounds, races, uh, whatever. Plurality of views must include the plurality of epistemic views. For me, this is a fundamental. I managed to have this in the paper, and I wanted to start the seminar highlighting this very small contribution. So, but I must say that I haven't, I'm not the first one who stresses out the need for epistemic plurality. In fact, this Farabend quote in a publication called Against Method, he explicitly drew the epistemological anarchist conclusion that there are no useful and exceptionless methodological rule governing the progress of science or the growth of knowledge. The history of science is so complex that if we insist on a general methodology which will not only inhibit progress, the only rule it will contain will be the useless suggestion anything goes. In particular, logical empiricist methodologies and proper critical rationalism would inhibit scientific progress by enforcing restrictive conditions or on new theories. Basically, I'm not saying that epistemic inclusivity is the same as epistemic anarchism. Epistemic anarchism doesn't mean um, that anything goes at all. Or maybe it does, that is a deeper philosophical question. But the point is that someone else, there is another school of thought which has introduced the notion of epistemic pluralism, albeit um, under a different label. So, a note on the title. The title of this webinar has changed a couple of times, but the keywords are against method, independent scholarship, and current scientific thought. Against method. So, insisting on epistemic plurality, which at the time I was contributing to that paper, seemed like, I really had to make that point. And then digging up, I realized that Vera Ben had worked on something similar. This realization came upon me that against method is not particularly well understood, nor appreciated, nor addressed in open science, but it is fundamental to open science. And therefore, this was another motivator for this webinar. So this webinar or seminar, which is not about Faraban himself or about his work, um, is just to serve as a reminder that there is a school of scientific philosophy which embraces principle which are labeled as against method, which open science should be aware of. So there is no point in talking about open science today without taking on board all this very important critique of scientific method, which was um, widely expounded by Veraband. Independent scholarship. Oh, now, what is independent scholarship? Since a lot of people are leaving academia, there are flaws with academia. There are flaws with within science, and people don't want to give up scholarship. So one of the points that Ronin Institute and to some extent other organizations in independent organizations make is that you know scholarship is a big thing. You can be a scholar in many ways. You don't have to be a research scholar or publish in high the journals with the high whatever they call it, high rankings. And but you can be a scholar according to different definitions, including your own. So I define scholarship driven by independent thinking, characterized by originality, innovativeness, single mindedness, ability to develop and defend individual views and methods. By the way, I should add this, and methods, and based on inquiry, not depending on funding. So I'm not a best example of a successful researcher, maybe, but I have been consistently doing interesting research and also occasionally getting published and getting to know a lot of interesting people in my field and getting to share and base my work on the most recent research findings and scientific knowledge. uh, at the back of my teaching work, for example. Very rarely I've been a pure researcher doing nothing else with a lot of funding. I have had a few funds to pursue certain projects like PhD or postdoc, but and I'm working on it, by the way. I want to thank in advance ICDOR for making it possible for independent scholars to apply for funding and using IGDOR affiliation in Europe, and I think to some extent Ronin Institute does the same. So not depending on funding, that's quite key. And um, you could say that the definition of what is independent scholarship is understood, but I don't think it is. In fact, I invite my colleagues to do a bit more work in coming out with a chapter that describes various forms of independent scholarship with different maybe I think we should write this up. I would invite everyone to collaborate on a publication, and one chapter should be devoted to independent scholarship, I think. And the big word three is science and current scientific paradigm, or the scientific revolution onwards. Now, we have had scientific and thinking throughout the ages. The more I look back to the ancients, the more I see very clear signs there from astronomy. Astronomy has been around for thousands of years. Very detailed knowledge of the planets, their motion, distances, without the current engineering, the technology to support it, nonetheless quite precise. And so this is awesome. However, we do consider modern science from the scientific revolution onwards. There have been more than one scientific revolution, hence the S on the slide. So, the result of multidisciplinary convergence. So, what we are seeing now, which is very exciting, is that we have multidisciplinary convergence. People coming to answer the same question from a variety of uh, disciplinary backgrounds. It's impacted by the data and knowledge explosion, resulting convergence with engineering, etc., etc. So we have a unique landscape in which the current scientific paradigm is developing, and that's exceptional. And this is where I think we should try to take a moment to appreciate and to realize that a lot of what has been until now is going to soon be fairly dead. And it is worth spending time understanding open science and independent scholarship because that's where things are happening now. Um, and increasingly increasingly so will happen in the future. Now, something which is not in the slide, and I don't remember if I put in a future slide, in a later slide, but is that there is also this dissolution of the boundaries, and there is some acceleration of innovation. So innovation, new thinking um, is being exchanged at increasingly fast pace. So we are witnessing something which has never been witnessed before in history. Scientific knowledge and tools are becoming more powerful, more opportunities for scientific advances. There are also more risks. There are increasing ethical concerns. Genetic and animal and human welfare and science, they're becoming an excuse. So now it's easier for everyone to say, oh, yeah, I'm a scientist, and to do unspeakable things. I'm not saying it easy, because it is not easy to decide when we're doing something in the name of science or not, even if it's cruel or appears to be cruel, as long as you can sacrifice a dozen of animals or humans now to save a million later. So these are the arguments that you can sacrifice in the sense of put them at risk, and not real sacrifice, I hope. But just there are a variety of instances, and I have participated in a number of ethical initiatives, ethical groups, ethical associations like bioethics and others, where the only thing these associations can do is acknowledge the risk. There is no association which has any power whatsoever to go and make and poke their nose into what people are doing in the labs, because organizations are very good at saying, oh yes, we follow these rules, and then find a lot of ways to bypass the rules without telling anyone. And and the bioethics and the ethical organizations will never know what these people have been doing, because there is no real um, because there are loopholes everywhere. And the stricter the laws become, the wider the gaps and the loopholes um, appear, or come about. So, and actually we must acknowledge the fact there are a number of researchers who are unethical, and I would go as far as saying criminals and mentally ill and schizophrenic. This is a personal um, consideration. I do not have the data to back it up, but I do not exclude having the data at some point. So, ethical concerns, I don't remember where the big word ethical concern was. Um, but there's this good story, there's an excellent example of called the I Speak Surgeon. Um, I think it's nonfiction. It's uh, it's a scientific literature, well documented. There are well documented cases in this book called I Speak Surgeon. You can find some. And you see, never mind the crackpots. So people are concerned that pseudoscience and all of that. But that worries me up to a point. What worries me most is the real criminals, manifest criminals who get away with being employed by reputable research organizations, and in fact having making very big names for themselves. So what characterizes science? I don't think I should be telling anyone what, but to me, a rational foundational approach to understanding the world and problem solving based on facts and explicit, verifiable and replicable methods. Although we know it is not always so. Unfortunately, a lot is sold for what it isn't. And there is a lot of science which is actually pseudoscience, which is past for science, and there is a lot of science which is past for pseudoscience. And it takes a lot of science to distinguish between the two. And then there is also takes a lot of debate as to what is science. And so this is how the entire establishments come about, symposia and all of that. And then niches develop and say, okay, for the people who think that science is that, they can go to that conference and write for that journal. And for the people who think that science is, or they narrow it down in another way, slice it in another way, and there are niches in science for everyone. And I think that in a way it's a good thing. It's a beautiful thing because now we can go and pick and choose what we consider the science most appropriate to us, to our the methods, tools, and paradigms most appropriate to, and we can all be scientists. And in a way, that is the uh, rationale for open science and citizen science. But we can say that some rational approach is the basis for the development of all aspects of human activity, and it is a universally understood language. So it is nice to be able to communicate along a few parameters. Unfortunately, I don't speak math. I don't communicate with formulas, but I know that some people do. I have seen scientists who do not speak each other languages simply communicate writing algebra, and having a perfect understanding. Um, and in a way, without necessarily using algebra, the scientific method is fairly understandable. This is another thing which I consider admirable about science: the fact that it can be rationalized. It can, kind of lays things out and makes them approachable. The way to go about things is, so we call it scientific and technical. So I'm technical about this because I lay out the ingredients, I lay out the steps and all the variables and the conditions, and then everyone can really see what I'm doing, as opposed of doing magical mystery. Nonetheless, despite the reliability of science and the scientific method which we praise, science is very rich of it has a long history of errors. So from Giordano Bruno to Galileo and many more blunders in modern times, when we teach open science, or when we practice open science, and when we teach open science, when we learn open science, we should remember that even the scientific method can be a false flag for, like, say, yes, yes, I'm doing it, I'm applying scientific method, and I cannot be wrong. And that's very wrong. So science uh, is not actually guaranteed that things cannot go wrong. It can go wrong like equally like non-science. So what is wrong with science? So if we do this critique, again, I'm not speaking to people who know this, because a lot of people would know this already. I'm speaking to those who are approaching science because now there are opportunities. And we do 1 or 2 or 3 years of foundational science courses and end up with a series of certainties and convictions which are arguable. So, a scientist, especially the young scientists and the students, as well as any practitioner at any level, should always be aware that there are limitations. So much importance is given to science in decision making. People are saying, oh, yeah, we've got the science, we've got the data, but are we sure? And a real honest scientist probably would have some doubt, um, would at least consider the possibility of error and would be able to evaluate the risks of error. But there is also some blind faith in science, so I think we should really be aware of that. What is considered scientific fact depends on variables, data collection, methods, models, axioms, research design. So very often, and this is a lot of what a peer review and a scientific journal saying, "Oh, I have published this in a scientific journal," but there is a good chance that there are some flaws. The data is not perfect. The method, it's arbitrary, or the method is valid up to a point. If we had used a different model, we could have had a different result. If we made one less assumption or one more assumption, we could have ended up with a different result. Or if the research design had been different, we could have ended up with a different conclusion or a different analysis of the result. So even science can be speculative, arbitrary, random, and have limited impact and even be wrong. So that's something I want to point out, because now that this open science and open scholarship are coming up, mm, we should define science for what it is and also for what it isn't. So different methods lead to different results, technically, which means every method can lead to a different version of the truth. And so that is where a lot can become very time consuming, or uh, one of the big limitations of what we consider um, scientific fact. What is wrong with science too? It does not cover what is not considered scientific interest and what is not directly observable in lab conditions. Most, I mean, there is some science which is like normally considered social science, which is done not necessarily in the lab, and there are other certain methods like. But generally speaking, if it's not considered, so some people say this is not a scientific interest, it's not a scientific question, and they just completely leave it out, leaving out the inquiry of inquiry entire sections of reality. So in a way, there are a lot of things out there which I would like to find, to know whether there is any science about them. But of course, the UFOs, levitation, reincarnation, but they're not science, so there's no research basically. The prevailing truth demarcation of the field of inquiry depends on the interest of a few. So, what is science and what is not science is very often defined by industry. So, there's all the renewable energy. I'm not going to go as far as saying free energy, but definitely the renewable field has not been really. It has been investigated a little bit and has been then politely put aside, because what and then all the resources are going into genetics or machine learning. There are billions of public funding devoted to absolutely interesting research, but maybe if people had a better appreciation of the priorities, we'll be putting this research in shifting from fossil fuel to renewables, research and practice. But instead, what is considered science or priority or worthy of investigation, worthy of public funding, is can be a little bit, uh, you know, decided by some. Fallacies, false analogies, arbitrary logic, double standards, scientific bias, denial of truth, and definitely influenced by private interests. What is wrong with science? Three, importance in science is often a matter of judgment, and the relative importance of scientific discoveries is very much dependent on the perspective taken by the evaluators. This is not my saying, is the saying of, I don't know if it's the same. Um, Here is the citation. The case against science, or how do you say, the critique of science. I should have said. The critique of science is straightforward. Much of the scientific literature, perhaps half, may simply be untrue, afflicted by studies with small sample sizes, tiny effects, invalid exploratory analysis, and flagrant conflicts of interest, together with an obsession for pursuing fashionable trends of dubious importance. Science has taken a turn towards darkness. This was a famous quote by Richard Horton, current editor of The Lancet. I don't know if he's still current editor of The Lancet at the time when the quote was stated, and I should take it onto me to write the date for this quote onto the slide. Another one, the absurdity of the Nobel Prizes in science. They distort the nature of the scientific enterprise, rewrite its history, and overlook many of its most important contributors. Ed Yong, The Atlantic, 2017. I have put the date here. So, the Nobel Prize as the apotheosis of scientific worth. It is not. Like every other prize, it's flawed and subjective. By reifying it, we overinflate the egos of those who receive it and we undermine those who do not. Again, this is not my quote. I believe it's all come from the same article. They, this is a quote from a paper. The paper is here. I'm going to take it upon me to write out the citations with the proper citation notation. They, this is quote coming from Cassidy Bell and Fang. A critique of Nobel Prize. They, the Nobel Prize award system, reinforce a flawed reward system in science in which the winner takes all and the contributions of the many are neglected by disproportionate attention to the contributions of a few. In some ways, the prizes are not about who has made the most important contribution, but who has best survived the hazardous labyrinth of academia. That's so true. And there are notable examples of arbitrary exclusion from the Nobel Prize in literature, which I don't know if I took them from some article. Rosalind Franklin was not recognized for her pivotal role in discovering the double helical structure of DNA because she died 4 years before the Nobel was awarded to Watson, Crick, and Wilkins. Astronomer Vera Rubin provided evidence for the existence of dark matter. Um, a feat that revolutionized our understanding of the universe. Many others, in much less important context. If this happens to the Nobel Prize, imagine what happens in the average teaching and research lab. So, so these are very notable, high-profile examples, but there are countless examples of people making contributions to science and being overlooked. So this is the table from the paper, very interesting, which analyzes systematically the year discovery over the controversy and gives citations of the references. So it's worth if you're interested in being aware of even the Nobel Prize, which is the highest reward in science and technology in science and in contributions in different fields. Um, Even that can be biased. Science is getting less bang for its buck. This is somewhere where I don't know where I go yet, from the Atlantic magazine, 2018. Despite vast increases in the time and money spent on research, progress is barely keeping pace with the past. What went wrong? This was an article. So there are diminishing returns in scientific investment. We're spending more money and we are making less discovery. Possible causes: scientific efforts are diverted, filtered, manipulated, diluted. So basically, what people are getting, this is what is happening. This is what I see as an examiner, as an evaluator, as an observer. There are large grants being given to institutions who then allocate the funds to professors and researchers who do something on paper, which, and then they use a lot of, I don't know whether I would say 90% of their time to do something else, and nobody will know. And when anyone blowing the whistle is simply not hired or sacked. So, either you're part of this or you're out. I'm not saying this is the case always, but there is a lot of that. So, less bang for the buck. Well, is anyone actually uh, really looking at what is going on in the labs? And then, what is wrong with research? Not to mention many research biases of academia and scholarly publication system. So we know this. There is a very big critique of this. Science versus scientism. Scientism defined as, not by me, but by some source, which I should quote. I will take it upon me to put the source for this, actually. Scientism, excessive belief in the power of scientific knowledge and techniques. Some concepts: paradigm, boundary, demarcation, relativism, reductionism. So this was introduction. Some of the concept being, and it was introduction, but we're already kind of half an hour into the talk. I'm gonna go try to whiz quickly through the rest of the slides. But the concepts that we're talking about um, are just picked out here. I often work with non-English speaking audiences, so it's very important for me to pick out the words and concepts and introduce them before I say anything. Actually, here it is worth mentioning that paradigm, it was defined by Kuhn. Boundary, demarcation, relativism. Here means we know this, no, but it means that the decision to treat the other people form of life and the beliefs it embodies as true for them while treating our own views as true for us. Relativism, reductionism, and other things that are going to come up in the next slides. What is Against Method? A book, a current of scientific thinking. Um, and it was actually mm, embraced in different ways or tackled or addressed in different ways by different scientists. So this Against Method, I recommend we develop this as a topic in our curriculum, open science curriculum. Popper, Lakatosh, Kuhn, Faraben, and possibly others. We should look more into this again. So there's a lot there. Why? Because what is wrong with science? So Against Method is a set of views, a current of scientific thinking that develops from the acknowledgement that there are some problems with science, as 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 a science is not holy and untouchable. That there are different ways of doing science. So the scientific method itself is open for debate. It is strongly related to methodological limitations and rigid and questionable epistemic stances and excessive belief in method, which I briefly mentioned this before. So you see, a lot of the science that we read in the journals, I don't have the time to study every method in every paper and check every result. But when I do, for whatever reason, because I'm interested or because I'm trying to reference it or use it, I actually find some holes in there. And it's only when and how many, but how many really go and read all the literature? Very few. You're gonna read the literature in relation to your field or by your peers or when you're hired as a reviewer. But very often we will just use their results. You say, okay, this is in the scientific literature. I'm doing the meta analysis. I'm picking out all the results and I am basing my work on whatever is already published. Big mistake, you know. Um, we cannot trust science like that at all. I mean, science like we cannot trust the research publications or the outcomes of published research as if they were true or pure gold. They should be checked. And rigorous methodology is not the same as a rigid methodology. So very often people are saying, "Oh, my method was, foolproof. I haven't swayed an inch. I haven't changed anything from it." That's a rigidity. Rigorous doesn't mean rigid. You can be rigorous and still make adjustments. In fact, this is what is sometimes necessary in experiments. You need to make adjustments, um, which is also when things can go wrong, obviously. So, against method was considered anti science. Feyerabend was famously dubbed as the worst enemy of science, and even today, philosophers of science will tend to associate his name with anti science polemics. The defenses of voodoo and astrology and more. I did mention astronomy earlier. Mistake. Worst enemies of science is attributed to science in Nature magazines. In this paper here, I think this is a published paper, and this worst enemies of science thing was attributed to an article in Science, in the Science Journal. But when I tried to reference it, and I instead of taking it as face value, I dug up a bit and I opened this article. I couldn't find this reference. I found it here. So it was in the Scientific American. I would be interested if someone find out. So the notion that Feyerabend was dubbed the worst enemy of science is attributed incorrectly to an article in Science Nature magazine by this author, but according to my research, it was actually attributed. It was actually first mentioned. Feyerabend was called the worst enemy of science by this guy called Horgan in '93. Let me know if I got anything wrong here. Feyerabend. The liberalization that Lakatos had in mind. So I should put something about Lakatos here. I'm sorry, I don't have the slide on that. But basically, Feyerabend took on Lakatos' work. And he came to embrace the relativist views that there is no single rationality, no unique way of attaining knowledge, and no single body of truth to be thereby attained. So, going over these slides 1 year after I wrote them makes me realize that there are some gaps here which I'm going to fill, I promise, into next talk. Feyerabend became intensely skeptical about the ambitions and achievements of Western rationalism, suspecting it to be the willing tool of Western imperialism. So, and this, some of us still think that. His 75 and 78 books against method and science in a free society famously gave expression to these anti rationalist themes and garnered, garnered an audience far wider than books in philosophy or science usually have. So basically, they were controversial, they made a noise, and he came to be seen as a leading cultural relativist. Not just because he stressed that some theories are incommensurable, which in itself is quite fascinating, but also because he defended relativism in politics as well as in epistemologies. So we have scientific relativism. I think we should really remember that in open science, and we should not have an open science that mimics or parrots the bad science and just make it open, because that would be spreading more bad science. A lot of open science these days is used to make the bad science more prominent. That is really criminal. So I'm going back to my initial thoughts of epistemic inclusivity. It doesn't mean that we all have to just call everyone to have their name as an author. It means that we have to evaluate every possible viewpoint, but of course, the validity of the viewpoint should always be evaluated as well. And also, I mean, there is a lot more to unpack there. Um, we should. So this slide brings me back to the epistemic inclusivity and to other of the earlier points. In the words of Faraban himself, Against Method, AM, Against Method is not a book, it's a collage. It contains descriptions, analysis, arguments that I published in almost the same words 10, 15, or 20 years earlier. I arranged them in a suitable order, added transitions, replaced moderate passages with more outrageous ones, and called the result anarchism. I love to shock people. I think, he started seeing the need to make a point. Successful research does not obey general standards. It relies now on one trick, now on another. The moves that advance it and the standards that define what counts as an advance are not always known to the movers. There's a little bit of mystery, of mystic, isn't there? A bit of what we call serendipity. Serendipity. So I think every scientist should learn about every new young researcher and open scientist should learn about open science, should learn about the limitations and the dark side of science, should also learn about serendipitous science, so how many incredibly important discoveries, scientific discoveries, including notoriously penicillin, were made by chance, but either by chance, but sometimes even more interesting, by mistake. And you say, "Oh, I thought I put that in the petri dish. Instead, I put the other thing, but something came out that is quite amazing." You see, you need to have that level of intelligence to be able to interpret when a result is valid, even if the method is botched. And unfortunately, in the labs these days, if you have not followed the protocol, your research would, even if you invented the new penicillin, it would probably go into the bin because you haven't followed there is you if you uh, stray from what is prescribed, the validity of your work is at risk unless you put it in your pocket and run away with it and go and write the paper when nobody sees you. So there is a lot of there is witch hunt going on. So if you come up with something which is the result of God knows what, very often is scrutinized in ways that are probably unscientific. So teachers using grades and the fear of failure mold the brains of the young until they've lost every ounce of imagination they might once have possessed. This is again a quote from the book. Science is essentially an anarchic enterprise. Theoretical anarchism is more humanitarian and more likely to encourage progress than its law and order alternatives. So there's another chap called Feynman who wrote What is Science? He gave a famous lecture or series of lecture, and somehow Feyerabend and Feynman are in the same bucket for me. Uh, I think there must be brothers in some way, but they belong to different institutions, different epochs. But see that bird? It's a brown-throated thrush, but in Germany it's called a Heisenflügel, and in Chinese they call it a chungli. And even if you know all the names for it, you still know nothing about the bird. I am missing quotes. I'm gonna have to go through these slides again. So another author worth looking up when preparing our lecture notes for open science, and if we're creating an open science walk, uh, we should pick out as much as we can from Feynman. My intention is not to replace one set of general rules by another such set. My intention is, rather, to convince the reader that all methodologies, even the most obvious ones, have their limits. Tada, this is the message. The best way to show this is to demonstrate the limits and even the irrationality of some rules, which she or he is likely to regard as basic. In the case that induction, including induction by falsification, this means demonstrating how well the counter-inductive procedure can be supported by argument. So this is another quote by Feynman that should be studied and addressed in the open science curriculum. Um, and this is a very long quote from the book Against Method by Fairbairn. I'm not going to read it, but it's about method, something similar to the previous quote. There is not a single rule. On the contrary, violations are necessary to progress. They can be. Violations are necessary for progress. Um, and then there's a whole history of philosophy, invention of atomism, and da. Worth reading this quote. A science that insists on possessing the only correct method is and the only acceptable results is ideology and must be separated from the state, and especially from the process of education. Now, this is fundamentally, and it somehow goes back to epistemic inclusivity. So I came up with epistemic inclusivity to compensate for the lack of depth in certain literature which defends the participatory science, but it doesn't really make the point of epistemic uh, participation at all. It kind of tries to avoid it. And after coming up with this epistemic inclusivity, which I had to insist upon by speaking with the editor himself, saying, my co-author are trying to glide over the epistemic aspect of participatory science, and then I managed to get it included. But ultimately, I realized that a lot of great people before me had made that point very strongly, and here is why this talk about against science was once again. I want to reiterate the motivation. So, on the other hand, the science that has dropped such totalitarian pretensions is no longer independent and self contained, and it can be taught in many different combinations. Myth and modern cosmology might be one such combination. So, at this point, we must open. This is relevant to open science very much. The epistemic of open science is here. I take this, how to say, it's a privilege for me to be speaking to my fellow researchers about this. So I'm almost 1 hour into the talk, and let me just, oh my gosh, I still have a lot of slides. Why don't we stop it here? We stop it here, and we're gonna make this a part two in another talk to be recorded separately. I think it's not healthy to have much more than an hour in a single talk. So um, please stand by for part two.